To the Brazilian delegation that came up this week for Select USA for Brazil on the Hill. I think that now more than ever, as we were talking about, it's a critical time for foreign investors in the United States to come to Washington, to raise their voices, to make sure that our current administration is aware of the key contributions that foreign investors, like good Brazilian companies like Stefanini, are bringing to our economy. So just thrilled to be here with you today. I am not going to mention anyone's bios. Please read them. These are fabulous people. We are lucky to have the opportunity to really hear about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil from a trade perspective, for really all of the key vantage points that you could imagine. We'll start out with Fernando Pimentel from the embassy giving us the Brazilian government perspective. From there we'll go to Monica de Bolle to give us more of the economist's point of view from Peterson, who has spent a great deal of her time really analyzing the macroeconomic and microeconomic situation in Brazil and how that plays into our bilateral relationship. From there we'll pass to Constanza from CNI, the Confederation, National Confederation of Industries, which when I explain it to Americans, I say, imagine NAM plus BRT plus the chamber, and then put it on steroids, and that's what CNI is. So really the voice of Brazilian private sector and industry. From there we'll pass to Ailtom, one of those fabulous Brazilian investors in the United States who's creating jobs and value here in our country. And then we'll pass to Gina, a fellow USTR refugee, along with myself, who will give us a little bit of perspective on the current situation in the United States on trade policy and how that all might play in. So with that as a backdrop, let's dive right in. Fernando.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll start seeing so many Brazilians here. I'll skip the part where, gives the basic data on Brazil. I'll go straight for it. If our Korean students have questions, then we can go back to that. But I'll start then saying very clearly that Brazil is facing a perfect storm. We are in the deepest and longest recession in our history, which is compounded by a very complex political environment. So looking from this very sort of a dire, it's all in the news aspect, we still have some positive signs. We have been one of the best performing stock markets in 2016. FDI is being strong, has always been strong during the crisis. The first months of this year, it's going even. It's breaking records for Brazil standards, which are already pretty high in FDI, and this can be attributed to the efforts in reforms we are pursuing and this confidence. I'll skip the macro reforms. I'm pretty sure some of the people will talk about that. I'll just go more to the areas of the area of trade, which is our focus here. And in trade, we have for a while, but we are seeing the world as sort of a fresh look. Brazil has always been a staunch supporter, and still is, and I think always will be, of the multilateral trading system, of the rules-based trading system, which benefits all of us, Brazil and the US, and we support that. But we, with intention of opening up more economy, and I think there's a clear consensus about that in Brazil. I don't think anybody in Brazil, from any point in the political spectrum, will say Brazil needs to be a more closed economy. There's a consensus in our society that we need to engage more with the global economy. We need to engage more with trading partners, and to do that we're starting. It's also a positive context in Mercosul, which is sort of a basis for us to think trade in Brazil has always been sort of a framework, and we are deepening and refocusing or redirecting our energies towards trade liberalization. but also we're negotiating what people can call the next generation agreements. We have our main one under negotiations is the agreement we're negotiating with the European Union, which has had sort of a increased impulse as of late, the last few months. And it's a very complete, very thorough agreement we're negotiating with Europeans. It's tough negotiation as well, but negotiating goods, services, investment, IP, procurement, everything is in there, and we're trying to get a very comprehensive deal. Also, we're talking with other partners which have shown interest amongst them in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Canada. These are more exploratory at this point, and we are making very strategic movements towards the Pacific Alliance. So starting from Mercosur, we're trying to engage Pacific Alliance. Brazil is about 40% of Latin America in population, area, and economy. So south of the Rio Grande all the way to Patagonia, 40% of what you imagine there, it's Brazil. But if you add the other countries of Mercosur and the other countries of the Pacific Alliance, you get up to 90% of the region's GDP and 80% of inter-regional trade. So it's a very significant portion of this whole region, which we're trying to link more. It is a viable target, a viable ambition in many ways, because it's partially done. Mercosur and its partners in South America, so the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Colombia, Peru, we already have free trade agreements, which by and large bind the continent. We have investment agreements with most of them. Brazil is also a key sort of a stone in this building, as most of the trade of our partners in the Pacific Alliance, the trade with Brazil is larger than they have amongst themselves. So, for instance, trade with Brazil and Chile, the flow is larger than the sum of the trade of Chile with Peru, Chile with Mexico, and Chile and Colombia. And this is true for all countries in the Pacific Alliance, but Colombia. So when we go, we depart from this strong starting point, we're looking more towards convergence, regulatory convergence, and harmonization of rules, logistics, so they can actually implement, sort of increase the flows. So this is, how we're looking towards the world. And yes, how about the States? We have a very, first of all, the States is a very important trade partner for us. It is the main source of our manufactured and semi-manufactured exports. It has a long partnerships, main investor in Brazil. So for us, it's key. Also, it really important for the States, especially if you think about in terms of surplus. Brazil has had a deficit in trade with the US for a long while. The last 10 years, it has been very strong at some points, reaching about $36 billion in goods and services at some points. And even now, in the midst of the big crisis we are in, last year, balance of goods and services was about $18 billion of surplus to the US. So what we are trying to do with the agenda in general with the US is refocus in sectors or in targets which we can actually pursue. We have a 10-point agenda, which has, not all points are economic, but many of them are. And we'll highlight what we're doing right now. First, we have the agenda, which has already been there, has been there for a while. It's sort of a strong backbone of what we are doing in trade. It's the agenda on regulatory convergence and trade facilitation. We have had many positive results out of that, and more than just the results themselves. We have found a way to operate channels of communication that allow us to do more, and we will continue to do more in press. It's very important for the pursuit of this agenda to have support of the private sector. Which we don't want to present ideas that maybe have no bearing on what the people in the private sector need. So you're very open, very open for suggestions, and we'll see how we can pursue this agenda, which everybody thinks is worthwhile, although it's not exactly very sexy or bombastic endeavor. We are also interested in the agenda to pursue with the U.S. an investment promotion agreement. We have already started discussing how we could have that. We have very different models, but with some flexibility we can approach these models, and we have something that we know hopefully will improve the flows of investment to the U.S. The U.S. is the most important investor in Brazil, but as of late, and maybe I'm wrong because of just last few months, but as of late in terms of years, the U.S. has been sort of lagging behind, especially China, Asia, and Europe in investments in key sectors, and we would like to have the U.S. back with more sort of stronger impetus again. We also have, we're pursuing the U.S. something it's not only trade, but it would open a whole new sort of area for cooperation, which is a technological safeguards agreement for the Alcântara spaceport. It's something we're trying to do in Brazil. And I think it is a promising sector, especially given the fact that here in the U.S. Space has gone away from sort of a government-only pursuit to something which is increasingly more borne by private sector. So we are open to possibilities. Brazil wants, as I said, for it to open its economy, engagement with the U.S. is key, and we are ready. We do not know yet how can we deepen, and all the aspects are not clear to us, the contour of the U.S. trade policy itself. This will probably take a little bit more time. Have to see how things go. We have a very positive trade relationship, but we are concerned about some signals that we have received, especially in increasing anti-dumping, use of trade remedies against many countries, which do affect Brazil. So this is a sign for concern, but we think we can sort of overcome this aspect and pursue the vigorous and promising agenda we have with the world and with the U.S. I'll stop here. Over.
Fernando, thank you so much. So Monica, would love to hear more from you as far as what's going on in Brazil economically and how that plays into the agenda that Fernando's laid out.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Kellie. Thank you, Ken and Antonio, for inviting me to be part of this panel on this extremely important topic, and a very timely one given what's happening in Brazil at the moment and what's happening here in the U.S. Let me say a few words first about the situation in Brazil, and then sort of touch upon some of the issues that Fernando has raised and raise some of my own. Brazil at the moment, I mean, to be an economist looking at Brazil, you have to be a political scientist at the same time, because it's just not possible to analyze anything in the economy without looking at the politics. And the politics, as you know, is extremely chaotic, messy, and in many ways unknowable, at least within the next 15 months that will take us from here to the October 2018 elections. And the October 2018 elections are another unknowable, given the current situation in the country. That being said, it is interesting that the very ambitious reform agenda that the government has initiated is actually moving along. Obviously, it's not moving along as fast as we like. Evidently, there have been significant delays in some of these reforms, in particular with regards to the pension reform, which is a key aspect of the macroeconomic framework in Brazil. As you probably know, Brazil faces, without the fiscal reforms, Brazil faces a very, very dire fiscal scenario going forward. The fiscal accounts are unsustainable, debt to GDP ratios are rising, deficits are also very high. So we do need pension reform in order to contain this growth trajectory of debt and of deficits. And it is unclear whether the pension reform will actually be approved in the form that it was originally formulated in light of the political difficulties that the country is facing. But that being said, the pension reform is still in Congress, is still being discussed, and that is, in some ways surprising given the depth of chaos that the country is in on the political side. The same, I think, can be said of the labor reform. The labor reform will likely pass, even if we don't have the same level of confidence with regards to the pension reform. Hopefully it will too. But nonetheless, it is quite incredible that these two efforts are moving along. As I said, these are two very ambitious reforms. They've been in the cards for the last 30 years in Brazil, and they are moving in spite of the political crisis. What has been most surprising to me, actually, not on the entire sort of platform of reforms, has been the change in attitudes towards trade in the last, I guess, year and a bit. And that is because Brazil in the last 30 years has had this very mercantilistic view of trade. So essentially it's all been about exports and no imports. May sound familiar to a few people in this town these days. And that has changed, or at least that's starting to change. And people in Brazil, as Fernando was saying, people in Brazil are starting to realize that trade is not just about, buying from others what you need and selling to others what you produce, but it's also about, and very much about buying from others what you need to produce and sell. So in other words, imports are very important for exports. And with that in mind, I think the way that people are looking at, openness and the trade agenda in Brazil is very different from the way that they used to look at these things in the past. Having said that, there are some issues, I think, still that need to be thought about and that need to be handled for Brazil to reap the benefits of some of these efforts that are, currently in place, as Fernando was describing, both with respect to integration within the region, so all of these efforts with the Pacific Alliance and with other countries, as well as with the U.S. Brazil is still a country that has a very, very strict level of non-tariff barriers, especially when you look at things like local content requirements, as well as the very complex, to say the least, rules of origin structure under the Mercosur. I'm following the NAFTA negotiations as well from the Peterson Institute of International Economics. We have a big project at the Peterson Institute looking at the NAFTA negotiations, and we're talking about rules of origin all the time. But when you compare rules of origin within NAFTA and rules of origins within the Mercosur, it's like you're talking about two completely different things, because within the Mercosur, it's just a complete labyrinth. And we really do need to move forward. Within the Mercosur countries really need to rethink the rules of origins issue. There needs to be simplification. There needs to be, some kind of framework where you have horizontal rules of origin across the several sectors and products, so that you can get rid of this very opaque and very, very difficult obstacle to trade. And the same is true for local content requirements in Brazil. We did get rid of some local content requirements in the oil and gas industry, and that's very much welcome. That has been a very good thing. but we still do have local content requirements in other sectors, and they are just as complex as the rules of origins within Mercosur when you look at the way that they operate. So for Brazil to really advance on its trade agenda, both within Latin America as well as with the US, we do need to get rid of these things, and we do need to simplify them quite substantially. The other area where I think, and Fernando mentioned this, and it's a welcoming step in Brazil, but there hasn't been a lot of thought into it, I think. When people talk of trade and talk of trade relations with the US, there's a lot of talk about the manufacturing side. And the manufacturing side in Brazil for the Brazilian authorities has been a bit of a fetish. You know, this idea that it is in manufacturing where you generate the most productive or the best paying jobs and the greater efficiencies and so on and so forth. And within that discussion, the services sector gets lost. And when you look at trade between the US and Brazil, there's a lot of services trade too. And we do need to advance that agenda in particular. So to look more at services trade rather than just, you know, trade and manufacturing, and consider some of these issues. So I'm going to stop my remarks there so as not to take up more time from my fellow panelists, but I hope we can come back to some of these issues in the Q&A section.